How does a person simply vanish from a public trail without a single witness? In 1975, that's exactly what happened to a young artist named Eleanor Vance. She walked into a forest to sketch and was never seen again. For 50 years, her case was a complete mystery. There was no body, no leads, and a killer who believed they had committed the perfect crime. But they made one mistake. They left behind a single clue, so small it was invisible to the naked eye. This is the incredible story of how modern science found that tiny clue and exposed a monster who had been hiding in plain sight for half a century. To see the full story and how this impossible case was solved, make sure you subscribe to our channel, Afterlight Cases. Chapter 1. The Disappearance of Eleanor Vance. The Vance house, tucked away at the end of a gravel road just outside of town, always smelled of damp earth, turpentine, and brewing coffee. It was a home filled with books and art, a small sanctuary of quiet creativity carved out of the rugged landscape of the Olympic Peninsula. On the morning of October 22nd, 1975, as rain streaked down the window panes and a kettle whistled on the stove, the routine was the same as any other. Eleanor Vance, at 21, was the quiet center of that home's universe. Her parents, lost to a fishing accident 3 years prior, had left her with a heavy responsibility: the house, the bills, and her 16-year-old brother. Leo. Eleanor, a young woman with long, dark hair and thoughtful eyes, handled this burden with a grace that seemed beyond her years. Dressed in a worn flannel shirt over a simple dress, she moved through the kitchen with a deliberate calm, pouring hot water into 2 mugs. Ellie, as everyone knew her, saw beauty where others saw decay, light where others saw only shadow. Her art wasn't a hobby, it was the language she used to speak to the world. Her brother Leo, a lanky teenager with a shock of unruly hair, stumbled into the kitchen, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Is that the last of the coffee?" he asked. With a soft smile, Eleanor replied, "It is, but I was going into town anyway. I'll pick up more." Leo grabbed a piece of toast. "You're going out in this? It's pouring." "The light is better when it's like this," she explained, softer. "The moss looks like velvet." Leo never quite understood his sister's fascination with what he called watching things grow. But he understood her. Their shared loss had forged a bond that was fiercely protective. He saw the weight she carried and did his best to lighten it with misplaced jokes and a teenager's clumsy attempts at helpfulness. He knew that when Ellie spoke of the light, she wasn't just talking about the sun. She was talking about the spark of life she sought to capture in everything. An hour later, Ellie was driving their old, slightly rusted pickup truck into the small town of Beacon Point. The town consisted of one main street lined with wooden storefronts, under a sign that read, Beacon Point, Pop 782. Her first and only stop was Miller's General Store, a place that sold everything from fishing lures and flour to flannel shirts and motor oil. The bell above the door chimed, announcing her arrival. Inside, the store was cluttered, but organized. Martha Miller, the kindly middle-aged owner, was behind the counter. "Eleanor, honey, I was wondering when you'd be in. That special paper you ordered arrived yesterday," Martha said. "Oh, thank you, Martha. I was hoping it would," Ellie replied. Their conversation was easy and familiar. They spoke of the coming winter, the price of coffee, and Leo's performance at the high school's last basketball game. To Martha, and to everyone in Beacon Point, Eleanor Vance was a fixture, a good, quiet girl who was raising her brother right, a permanent part of the town's fabric. As Ellie paid for her coffee and the heavy parcel of artist's paper, Martha cast a glance at the darkening sky outside. "You're not heading up to the trails today, are you?" Martha asked. "Looks like this storm is settling in for good." Ellie smiled reassuringly. "Just for a little while. There's a patch of ghost orchids I want to sketch before the first frost gets them. I won't wander far. I never do." The forest was Ellie's studio. Her truck was parked at a familiar trailhead where the rain had softened to a fine mist. She put on a dark green wool coat, pulled her long hair back, and grabbed a worn leather satchel. She knew its paths the way a sailor knows the stars. Her worn hiking boots found their footing on the familiar trail, a path she had walked 1,000 times. Inside her satchel were her tools: charcoal pencils, a kneaded eraser, and her sketchbook, its pages filled with the delicate, intricate life of the forest floor. She wasn't just an observer of nature, she was a participant in its quiet, unfolding story. As she walked deeper into the woods, the fog grew thick, muffling all sound except for the drip of water from the canopy and the crunch of her boots on the trail. She had promised Martha she wouldn't wander far. She had promised Leo she'd be home to make dinner. And she had no reason to believe this day would be any different from the hundreds of others she had spent in the embrace of these woods. She was chasing the light, searching for one last patch of fleeting beauty before the world turned to winter. Back at the Vance house, the light outside was fading quickly. It was late afternoon, around 4:30. The rain had picked up again, lashing against the windows. Leo was doing his homework at the kitchen table, the radio playing softly in the background. He glanced at the clock, an unconscious habit. Ellie was usually back by 4, especially when the weather was bad. He told himself she'd probably found a dry spot under an overhang and had lost track of time, lost in her work. It had happened before. But as the clock on the wall ticked past 5 and then 5:30, the familiar shape of his sister's truck failed to appear in the driveway. Darkness had now completely fallen. The only light came from the warm glow of the kitchen. A knot of unease began to tighten in Leo's stomach. He walked to the front door and peered out into the black, rain-swept night. The wind howled through the pines, a low, mournful sound. He called her name, his voice small and thin against the storm. Ellie. The only answer was the drumming of the rain on the roof. By 6 o'clock, the unease had turned to real fear. He picked up the phone, his hand trembling slightly, and dialed the number for the town sheriff. He stood by the window, silhouetted against the light of the house, staring into an impenetrable wall of darkness and fog. The forest that was once his sister's sanctuary now looked like a predator that had swallowed her whole. Chapter 2. The Community Search and the First Clue. The phone call from a panicked 16-year-old on a stormy Wednesday night was not an unusual occurrence for Sheriff Al Brody. In his 25 years as the law in Beacon Point, he'd fielded dozens of similar calls, which almost always ended with a teenager returning home after a fight with a boyfriend or a missed curfew. He listened patiently to Leo Vance, his voice a calm and steady presence against the boy's rising fear. Brody knew the Vance kids. He'd known their father. He promised he would send a deputy to check the trailhead. But in his gut, he figured Eleanor had simply been caught in the downpour and had found shelter in an old ranger cabin to wait it out. An hour later, Deputy Miller's voice crackled over the radio. He'd found Eleanor's pickup truck parked at the entrance to the Callaway Trail, just as Leo had said. It was locked, and there were no signs of disturbance. The rain was coming down in sheets now, turning the access road into a river of mud and making the forest an impenetrable wall of black. A search was impossible until morning. Sheriff Brody relayed the news to Leo, advising him to lock the doors and try to get some sleep. But sleep was a luxury that no one in the Vance house would know for a very long time. By sunrise, the rain had stopped, but a thick, cold fog remained, clinging to the ground and weaving through the trees. News in a town like Beacon Point travels faster than fire. Before Sheriff Brody had even finished his first cup of coffee, a crowd was gathering outside Miller's general store. Loggers with faces hardened by weather stood next to fishermen in worn rubber boots. Worried mothers held thermoses of hot coffee, and high school kids, Leo's classmates, stood in awkward, silent groups, their faces pale with a fear they didn't yet understand. Martha Miller had turned her store into an unofficial command post, handing out sandwiches and directing people to sign-in sheets. It was the unspoken code of the town. When one of their own was in trouble, the town became a single entity, a single search party. Sheriff Brody, a man whose weary eyes had seen too much, stood on the store's porch and addressed the crowd of nearly 100 volunteers. He mapped out the search grids on a large topographical map of the parklands, his thick finger tracing the ravines and creeks where a person might have fallen. He warned them to search in pairs, to shout Ellie's name at regular intervals, and to mark their paths with brightly coloured tape. He saw the grim determination in their faces and knew he wouldn't have to ask them to be careful. The forest that provided their livelihood could also be their enemy. They respected its power. The search began. Lines of people, armed with walking sticks and hope, moved into the silent, dripping woods. Their calls echoed through the pines, a repeating chorus of a single name. Ellie! Eleanor! But the fog seemed to swallow the sound, and the only reply was the drip of water from branches and the rustle of their own movements through the damp undergrowth. They covered the main trails first, then fanned out, pushing through thorny salmonberry bushes and climbing over moss-slicked fallen logs. Hours passed. The initial energy of the search began to wane, replaced by a gnawing dread. The forest was vast, and the silence felt profound, unnatural. It was just after 2 in the afternoon when a shout went up, from a ridge about a quarter-mile east of the Callaway Trail. A young logger named Ben Carter had spotted something tucked near the base of a towering cedar tree, partially shielded from the rain. It was Ellie's sketchbook. Sheriff Brody made his way to the location, his heart heavy. The leather-bound book was damp to the touch, its pages slightly warped, but otherwise unharmed. He carefully opened it. Page after page was filled with Eleanor's familiar, meticulous drawings, the delicate gills of a chanterelle mushroom, the intricate pattern of lichen on a rock, the feathered face of a barred owl. He flipped to the last page. There, rendered in soft charcoal, was an unfinished sketch. It was the ghost orchid she had told Martha she was looking for. The drawing was detailed, capturing the flower's ethereal, almost translucent petals, but it stopped abruptly. The background was only faintly suggested, and the shading on the lowest petal was incomplete. Tucked into the book's spine was a single, sharpened charcoal pencil. There were no frantic marks, no torn pages, no signs of a struggle. It was as if she had been calmly working one moment, and in the next, had simply set her book down and walked away. As dusk began to bleed through the trees, Sheriff Brody called off the search for the day. The volunteers trudged back to the trailhead, their faces streaked with mud and exhaustion. The discovery of the sketchbook hadn't brought relief, it had deepened the mystery, replacing the simple fear of an accident with a chilling, formless unease. Standing by Ellie's empty truck, Brody looked back into the darkening woods. The silence that came from the pines was no longer peaceful. It was the heavy, watchful silence of a place that was keeping a secret. Chapter 3. The Investigation Goes Cold, 1975. The discovery of Eleanor's sketchbook did not bring clarity. It brought a deeper, more unsettling kind of confusion. In the days that followed, the frantic, town-wide search gave way to a more formal and frustrating police investigation. Sheriff Al Brody, a man more accustomed to settling property disputes than hunting for a person who seemed to have been erased by the landscape, found himself overwhelmed. His office in 1975 was a world away from modern forensics. Investigations were run on coffee, shoe leather, and intuition. His evidence locker was a repurposed supply closet, and his primary investigative tool was a rotary phone that sat on a desk buried under mounds of paperwork. The single Polaroid he'd taken of the sketchbook was grainy and dark, a useless artifact of a moment that offered no answers. The search continued, but the numbers of volunteers began to dwindle as the days turned cold and wet. Hope is a difficult thing to sustain against the relentless indifference of the wilderness. It was on the 4th day, in a section of the forest nearly a mile from where the sketchbook had been found, that a deputy made the second discovery. Snagged on the thorny branches of a devil's club bush was Ellie's dark green wool coat. It was caked in mud and soaked through, but it was unmistakably hers. The location was puzzling. It was far from any established trail, in a thicket of undergrowth that a person would have to fight their way through. For the first time, there was a tangible suggestion of a struggle, a desperate flight from something or someone. Sheriff Brody brought the coat back to his office and laid it carefully on a clean table. He examined it under the bright fluorescent lights, looking for any clue the forest might have missed. He found nothing. No tears, no bloodstains. It was just a muddy coat. But as he ran his fingers over the buttons, he noticed one was loose, hanging by a single, thick thread. He leaned in closer, his old eyes squinting. There, caught in the fibers of the thread, was something that didn't belong. It was a minuscule particle, so small it was almost invisible, that glinted under the light. Using a pair of tweezers from a first aid kit, he carefully worked it free and placed it in a small evidence envelope. He had no idea what it was, only that it was foreign to a wool coat and a pine forest. He sent the button, still attached to its thread, along with the tiny particle, to the State Crime Lab in Olympia. In 1975, this was the extent of his forensic capability. He held onto a sliver of hope that the scientists in the city, with their advanced equipment, could tell him something useful. The report that came back 3 weeks later was a crushing disappointment. The lab had identified the particle as a fragment of glass. They noted it was not from a car's windshield or a common bottle. Its chemical composition was, they wrote, unusual. But they had no database for comparison, no way to trace its origin. It was an anomaly without context. The tiny clue was a dead end. The button and the report were filed away in a cardboard box labelled Vance, Eleanor, Evidence. As autumn bled into a bleak, unforgiving winter, the investigation stalled completely. The forest floor was now covered in snow, sealing away any secrets it still held. The official search was suspended. Sheriff Brody had interviewed every known associate of Ellie's, followed up on dozens of fruitless tips, and re-examined the meager evidence until his eyes burned. He had nothing. The trail had not just gone cold, it had vanished as completely as Ellie herself. With the silence of the official investigation, the whispers of the town grew louder. In the booths of the diner and the aisles of the general store, theories took root and spread like wildfire. Some, clinging to hope, believed Ellie had simply run away. They spoke of a secret boyfriend, a desire to escape the confines of a small town, and the burden of raising her brother. Others took a darker view. They talked of the transient loggers who passed through the region, men with no names and no histories. They whispered about hunters who might have mistaken her for a deer, a tragic accident concealed by panic. The most prevalent theory was that she had fallen, that her body lay at the bottom of a hidden ravine, or one of the dozens of unmapped, abandoned mine shafts that riddled the mountains, a victim of the same unforgiving wilderness she had loved so dearly. Each theory was a way for the town to make sense of the unthinkable, to place a story where there was only a horrifying void. Ellie Vance, the quiet artist, was slowly ceasing to be a person. She was becoming a cautionary tale, a ghost that haunted the edges of their town and the depths of their woods. Chapter 4. A Brother's Lifelong Investigation. For the town of Beacon Point, the first snows of 1975 brought a merciful blanket of white, covering the muddy trails and silencing the forest under a heavy peace. For most, this marked an ending. The search for Eleanor Vance was over, at least until the spring thaw. The town's collective grief, sharp and frantic in October, began to dull into a chronic, sorrowful ache. Life, as it always does, went on. But in the small house at the end of the gravel road, time had stopped. For 16-year-old Leo Vance, the changing of the seasons meant nothing. His world had fractured on a rainy Wednesday in October, and every day since had been spent trying to make sense of the pieces. The silence in the house was the loudest sound he had ever known. It was a physical presence, a weight in the air where his sister's quiet movements and soft humming should have been. At first, he couldn't bring himself to even look at her bedroom door. It remained closed, a silent monument to a life interrupted. At school, he became a ghost. His friends, unsure of what to say, eventually said nothing at all. He would see them in the hallways, their laughter echoing from a world he no longer belonged to. He ate his lunch alone in the library, the smell of old paper a faint reminder of the sketchbooks his sister used to fill. He could feel the pity in his teacher's eyes and hear the whispers that followed him like a shadow. The poor Vance boy, the one whose sister walked into the woods and never came out. The tragedy had set him apart, placing him behind an invisible wall of grief that no one his age could possibly understand or scale. His transformation began subtly, not with a decision but with a desperate need. One bleak afternoon in January, driven by a loneliness that was too much to bear, he opened the door to Ellie's room. It was exactly as she had left it. A half-finished painting of a fern sat on her easel, the greens and browns still vibrant. Her books on botany and art history were stacked neatly on her desk. The air still held the faintest scent of her, a mix of charcoal and the wildflower soap she always used. It wasn't a painful experience, as he had feared. It was a comfort. In this room she was still real, still present. It was the world outside that had become a ghost. That day, he found one of her older sketchbooks, one filled not with forest scenes, but with practiced drawings of his own face, captured in moments of laughter, boredom, and sleep. Seeing himself through her eyes, he was reminded of who she was beyond the tragedy. A sister, a guardian, an artist. And he was reminded of who he was, her brother. It was then that a quiet, fierce resolve took root in his heart. The town might turn his sister into a ghost story, but he would not. He would keep her real. The mission started with a single newspaper clipping from the Beacon Point Ledger, its headline stark, "Community scours forest for missing artist." He carefully cut it out and pinned it to the corkboard above her desk. He added the faded missing person poster Sheriff Brody had given him. He found the sympathy cards that had flooded their mailbox in the first few weeks and organized them in a box, reading each one, memorizing the names. This collection was not about mourning. It was about evidence. It was an act of defiance against the silence. After he graduated from high school, everyone expected him to leave Beacon Point. Counselors spoke of scholarships and fresh starts, of putting the tragedy behind him. But leaving felt like a betrayal. Leaving meant accepting that Ellie was gone forever. Leaving meant abandoning his post. He stayed. He took a job at the lumber mill, the same mill where his father had worked. The work was hard, physical, and blessedly mindless. It paid the bills, and more importantly, it allowed him to remain in the one place on earth that mattered, the town where his sister was last seen. His life found a new grim routine. From 7 to 4, he worked at the mill, his days filled with the scream of the saws and the smell of fresh-cut cedar. But his evenings and weekends belonged to Ellie. He became an amateur detective, a chronicler of his own family's tragedy. He bought a large topographical map of the county and mounted it on Ellie's bedroom wall, which had now become his office. He used red pins to mark the trailhead where her truck was found, the location of the sketchbook, the spot where her coat had been snagged. He began re-interviewing people years after the fact. He would sit with Martha Miller at the general store, a small notebook in hand, asking her to recall every detail of Ellie's last visit. He spoke with Ben Carter, the logger who had found the sketchbook, asking him to walk him through the discovery again and again, hoping some forgotten detail might surface. Most people were kind, their sympathy for him renewed by his quiet, relentless dedication. They answered his questions, their memories now softened by the passage of time. He filled notebooks with these conversations, with timelines, with lists of the transient workers who had been in the area in the fall of 1975. His relationship with Sheriff Brody evolved. The sheriff, burdened by a guilt he could never voice, saw in Leo a reflection of his own failure. He gave the young man copies of his official reports, letting him read the witness statements and the frustratingly inconclusive lab results. He knew it was unconventional, but he also knew that Leo Vance was living a life sentence of uncertainty. If sharing the case files offered some small measure of control, Brody couldn't bring himself to deny him that. The years passed. Leo, once the lanky teenager, became a quiet man in his 20s, then his 30s. He never dated, never formed any lasting relationships outside of a few friendships at the mill. His life was the mill, the house, and the archive. The townspeople grew accustomed to his eccentricity. He was no longer just the Vance boy. He was a local fixture, a man defined by his vigil. They would see his truck parked at remote trailheads on weekends and know he was out walking, searching, still hoping to find what 100 men had failed to find years ago. His singular focus was both pitied and respected. He was the keeper of the town's greatest sorrow, a living reminder of the day the forest took one of their own. By the time he was 40, Ellie's room was unrecognizable. The walls were a dense collage of maps, photographs, and notes, all connected by an intricate web of colored string. It was the physical manifestation of a man's mind trying to solve an impossible puzzle. He had every newspaper article ever written about the case. He had his own transcripts of dozens of interviews. He had weather charts from October 1975. It was the most comprehensive collection of information on the disappearance of Eleanor Vance in the world. And it was all housed in the bedroom of a man who had sacrificed his own future to keep his sister's past alive. He wasn't just searching for his sister anymore. He was searching for the truth. A truth he believed was the only thing that could ever set him free. His vigil was his life's work, a silent 50-year promise to a sister lost in the pines, waiting for a clue he was beginning to believe would never come. Chapter 5. Decades pass and the case is archived. The years that followed were marked not by events, but by their absence. Time in Beacon Point began to move differently for everyone the case had touched. For Sheriff Al Brody, it was a slow, grinding erosion of confidence. The Eleanor Vance case file, a thick, perpetually expanding stack of manila folders, migrated from the corner of his desk to a dedicated drawer in his filing cabinet. He'd pull it out every few months, usually on a quiet winter night, when a fresh snow reminded him of that first, hopeless winter. He would spread the contents across his desk, the grainy photos, the typed witness statements filled with contradictions, the cryptic lab report about a single, insignificant piece of glass. He'd stare at the map, at the faded red pins that marked a geography of failure, and feel the same cold helplessness as he had in 1975. The case became his ghost, a silent passenger that rode with him on patrol and sat with him in the quiet of his office long after everyone else had gone home. The town, meanwhile, began the slow, unconscious process of healing by forgetting. The initial, raw wound of Ellie's disappearance scabbed over, leaving a permanent but less tender scar. People stopped talking about it every day. The posters with Ellie's face, which had been taped to every storefront window and telephone pole, grew faded and tattered by the rain and sun. One by one, they were taken down, not out of disrespect, but out of a communal need to look forward, to believe again in the safety of their small, isolated world. New tragedies, smaller but more immediate, took its place in the town's conversation. A logging accident, a bad fishing season, the closure of the old cannery. The Vance case receded from daily consciousness into the realm of local history. For Leo, this slow fading was the cruelest part of the ordeal. He watched as the town wrapped his sister's memory in folklore. She was no longer Eleanor Vance, the artist, the sister who made him coffee in the morning. She became the Pine Girl, a ghost story used to frighten teenagers away from the Callaway Trail. He would overhear snippets of the myth in town, a story that grew more elaborate and less truthful with each passing year, and a quiet, helpless rage would burn in his chest. His archive became his only weapon against this erasure. While the town was forgetting the details, he was engraving them onto his soul, ensuring that the real Eleanor, the one of flesh and blood and dreams, would not be replaced by a campfire tale. In 1995, 20 years after Ellie vanished, Sheriff Brody retired. His farewell party at the town grange was a quiet affair. He was a respected man, but everyone knew the Vance case had taken something from him. The new sheriff, a younger man transferred from a larger precinct downstate, was energetic and full of modern ideas about policing. During the transition, Brody walked him through the station's back office, where the unsolved cases were kept. He paused before one particular filing cabinet and pulled open the bottom drawer. It was filled with a single case. "This is the one," Brody said, his voice heavy. "The one that'll keep you up at night." He didn't need to say the name. He slid the drawer shut, the sound echoing with a finality that felt like a burial. A few weeks later, as part of a station-wide reorganization, the contents of that drawer were officially transferred. The thick collection of files, the evidence box containing a wool coat button and a single lab report, and the faded photographs were placed into a large cardboard archive box. With a piece of black marker, a clerk wrote on the side, "Vance, Eleanor, unsolved, 10/22/1975. The box was sealed with packing tape and driven to the county courthouse, where it was placed on a metal shelf in a damp, poorly lit basement room. This was the silent archive, the official graveyard for the county's forgotten sorrows. The Vance box sat beside others detailing unsolved arsons, decades-old burglaries, and other missing persons cases that had long since grown cold. Here, the case officially died. It was no longer an active investigation, not even a cold one. It was an artifact. The paper in the files grew brittle. The ink on the reports began to fade. The metal shelf gathered a thick coat of dust, and the box sat, undisturbed, as the world outside changed. The 1990s gave way to a new millennium. Technology surged forward, bringing with it computers, the internet, and mobile phones, tools that would have seemed like science fiction to Sheriff Brody in 1975. In Beacon Point, the Callaway Trail was quietly, unofficially closed. The Forest Service cited soil erosion, but everyone knew the real reason. No one wanted to walk in those woods anymore. The trail became overgrown, its entrance slowly reclaimed by the same wilderness that had swallowed Ellie. The town's character shifted. The lumber mill, once the town's lifeblood, downsized, and tourism became a more important industry. New families moved in, buying up old properties and renovating them into vacation homes. These new residents would sometimes hear the story of the Pine Girl, but to them, it was just that, a story, a piece of local colour. They had no connection to the real girl, no memory of the terror that had gripped the town, no understanding of the quiet, middle-aged man who worked at the mill and lived alone in the house at the end of the gravel road. They didn't see the light that always burned in one of his windows late into the night, illuminating a wall covered in a sprawling, desperate map of a 50-year-old question that had no answer. While the official archive slept under a blanket of dust, Leo's private archive was alive, a testament to a brother's promise that as long as he was breathing, the search for his sister would never truly be over. Chapter 6. The Case is Reopened, 2025. 50 years is an eternity in law enforcement. It is long enough for evidence to degrade, for witnesses to die, for memories to curdle into myth. By the autumn of 2025, the disappearance of Eleanor Vance was no longer a case. It was a ghost story, a piece of Beacon Point's dark folklore. The cardboard box containing her life and death sat on a forgotten shelf in the county courthouse basement. A silent archive of a 50-year-old failure. But 50 years is also long enough for technology to leap across impossible chasms and for a new generation to arrive, unburdened by the failures of the past. That new generation arrived in the form of Detective Isabella Rossi. At 34, Rossi was the head of the county's newly formed cold case unit, a grand title for what was, in reality, a one-woman operation working out of a converted storage closet with a state-of-the-art computer and a mandate to digitize the county's skeletons. She had transferred from Seattle, trading the relentless pace of urban homicide for the quiet, methodical work of unraveling the past. She believed that cold cases weren't dead. They were simply sleeping, waiting for the right person to wake them up. Her first task was to descend into the courthouse basement, the official graveyard of the county's unsolved crimes, and bring its contents into the 21st century. For weeks, her world was dust and brittle paper. She scanned faded reports on unsolved arsons and decades-old burglaries, each file a small tragedy. Then, one afternoon, she pulled a heavy box from a high shelf. The black marker on its side was faded but clear. Vance Eleanor, unsolved, 10/22, 1975. She sliced through the half-century-old tape and lifted the lid. Inside, she did not find the chaos of a forgotten case. She found order. Sheriff Al Brody's handwriting was neat and legible, his reports meticulously detailed. He had documented every dead-end lead, every whispered rumor, every fruitless search. Rossi found herself feeling a strange kinship with this long-retired sheriff she had never met. He had cared deeply. His frustration was a palpable presence in the neatly organized files. As she read, the story of the Pine Girl began to shed its mythological skin, revealing the real, vibrant young woman at its heart. Rossi spent a week absorbed in the Vance case. She scanned every document, every photograph, every map, but it was the recurring mentions of the victim's brother that caught her attention. Brody's notes were filled with references to Leo Vance. Spoke with the brother, Leo, again today. He has a new theory. Leo Vance dropped off another list of names. The brother believes we are missing something. The official file documented a parallel, unofficial investigation that had never ceased. On a hunch, Rossi ran a record search. She was not entirely surprised to find that a Leonardo Vance, age 66, still resided at the same address listed on the original 1975 report. 2 days later, she drove her unmarked vehicle down the same gravel road where Ellie had lived. The house looked tired, its paint peeling, the garden overgrown but for a single well-tended rosebush near the porch. The man who answered the door looked just as weathered as the house. Leo Vance was thin and stooped, with the pale, guarded eyes of someone who has spent a lifetime looking inward. He regarded Rossi and her police credentials with a weary resignation. He had seen investigators come and go over the decades, fresh-faced deputies and seasoned detectives who would periodically take a fresh look at the case, only to retreat in defeat. "I've already told my story 100 times, he said, his voice raspy. "It's all in the files." "I've read the files, Mr. Vance," Rossi said, her tone respectful. "Every word. I was impressed by Sheriff Brody's work, and by yours. I'm not here to ask you the same old questions. I'm here because I think you both missed something, and I think you might be the only person left who can help me find it." Something in her directness, in her acknowledgement of his own lifelong work, seemed to pierce his armor. For 50 years, he had been treated as a grieving relative, a tragic figure. This woman was speaking to him as a peer. After a long, silent moment, he stepped aside and let her in. The inside of the house was a time capsule. The furniture was from the 1970s, the air thick with the smell of old paper and dust. He led her not to the living room, but down a short hallway to a closed door. "She's in here," he said softly, and pushed the door open. Detective Rossi had expected a shrine, a bedroom preserved in amber. What she saw made her stop dead in her tracks. It was an investigation room, a floor-to-ceiling, wall-to-wall cathedral of obsession. The large map from 1975 was still there, now covered in a complex web of faded colored string that connected dozens of additional notes and photographs. Filing cabinets lined one wall, their drawers meticulously labelled. Shelves overflowed with 3-ring binders, each one filled with handwritten notes, transcripts, and timelines. It was the silent, beating heart of a 50-year investigation, a living archive that made the official police file in the basement look like a child's summary. Leo watched her, his expression unreadable. "The police stopped looking," he said, his voice devoid of accusation. It was simply a statement of fact. "I didn't." For the next 4 hours, Detective Rossi didn't speak. She listened. Leo Vance, the quiet man from the lumber mill, became an eloquent and precise historian, walking her through 50 years of research. He spoke of the subtle inconsistencies in witness statements that only became apparent after years of review. He showed her his own interviews with townspeople who had been too afraid or too shy to speak with the police. He possessed a level of detail that was breathtaking. He was the case's living memory. An unlikely partnership was forged in that room, between the detective armed with 21st century technology and the archivist's brother armed with a half-century of devotion. Late that evening, as Rossi was reviewing one of Leo's binders labelled Physical Evidence, she found it. It was a transcript of one of Leo's conversations with Sheriff Brody from 1988, a year after Brody had retired. Leo had asked him what his biggest regret in the case was. Brody's answer was specific. "That button from her coat," Brody had said, according to Leo's notes. "There was a fleck of something on it. Glitter, maybe. Strange. The lab said it was just glass, but it always bothered me. Felt like it was screaming at me, and I just couldn't hear what it was saying." Rossi looked up from the page, her heart pounding. The official lab report she had scanned was dry and technical, mentioning only an unidentified glass-like particle. But Brody's words, filtered through Leo's faithful archive, gave the clue a voice. It wasn't just a particle. It was something that had bothered the lead detective for the rest of his career. She looked at Leo, the lamplight casting long shadows across the crowded room. For the first time in 50 years, a new, tangible hope had entered the house. She now had more than a hunch. She had a reason, a specific, documented reason, to awaken the most silent witness of all. Chapter 7. The Forensic Breakthrough. Analyzing the Glass. Sheriff Brody's words, preserved for decades in Leo's meticulous notes, were the key. They transformed the microscopic glass fragment from a forgotten piece of evidence into the central focus of a 50-year-old mystery. For Detective Isabella Rossi, it was the justification she needed. It was one thing to retest old evidence on a hunch. It was another thing entirely to follow the instinct of the original investigator, to pick up a thread he had been forced to abandon. The next morning, she wasn't in the dusty courthouse basement. She was standing in the sterile, climate-controlled environment of the county's central evidence facility. This was where evidence from active and cold cases was preserved under modern, exacting standards. A world of barcodes and refrigerated lockers that would have been unimaginable in 1975. She signed the chain of custody log, and a technician retrieved the archive box labelled Vance. "Eleanor." The tape, brittle with age, crackled as Rossi sliced it open. Inside, nestled amongst the yellowed files, was a sealed evidence bag containing the dark green wool coat. It had been carefully preserved, but time had still taken its toll. The fabric was faded, and the coat seemed fragile, a ghost of the garment Ellie had worn on her final day. Rossi and the technician carried it to an examination room. Under the bright, unforgiving light of a forensic lamp and the powerful lens of a digital microscope, they began their search. They found the button easily, still hanging by its thick, 50-year-old thread. As Rossi zoomed in with the microscope, the image on the large monitor beside them sharpened. And there it was. Lodged deep within the wound fibers of the thread was a sliver of something that caught the light with an unnatural fire. It was infinitesimally small, no bigger than a grain of salt. To the naked eye, it was nothing. To Sheriff Brody, it had been a piece of glitter. But to Detective Rossi, it was everything. With the steady hand of a surgeon, the technician used a pair of microforceps to extract the particle, a painstaking process that took nearly an hour. The tiny fragment was secured in a sterile container, labeled and prepared for a journey 50 years in the making. The Washington State Forensics Laboratory in 2025 was a temple of science. It was a place of silent humming machines, where technicians in white coats coaxed secrets from the smallest traces of human contact. The fragment from Ellie's coat was delivered to the Trace Evidence Department, a lab that specialized in analyzing materials so small they were measured in microns. The technology they would use on this single particle was called laser ablation inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry, or LAICP-MS. In 1975, it was the stuff of science fiction. In 2025, it was the key to unlocking the past. The science was as elegant as it was powerful. A high-energy laser, focused to a point thinner than a human hair, would vaporize a microscopic portion of the glass fragment, a sample so small it would be invisible. This vaporization would create a tiny cloud of plasma, superheated atoms of the glass itself. This atomic cloud would then be passed through a mass spectrometer, a machine capable of identifying every single element inside, down to the parts per billion. It was the chemical equivalent of a DNA test. It wouldn't just tell them the fragment was glass. It would give them its unique recipe, a chemical fingerprint as distinct as any person's. The lab technician placed the nearly invisible fragment into the machine's sample chamber. On the computer screen, a series of complex graphs began to form as the analysis unfolded. For decades, this piece of glass had been silent. Now, under the intense energy of the laser, it was finally speaking, and it was telling them its life story. The results that came back a week later were more revealing than Rossi had dared to hope. The 1975 lab report had been correct in one regard. The glass was unusual. But unusual wasn't a strong enough word. The analysis showed a base of silica and lime, standard for most glass, but it was the trace elements that told the story. The vibrant green color of the fragment came from a high concentration of iron oxide, but it was mixed with a specific ratio of chromium and cobalt, a combination used to create a deep, forest green hue. More importantly, the analysis detected trace amounts of rare earth minerals, neodymium and erbium. These elements weren't found in industrial glass, not in bottles or windows or car headlights. They were expensive, specialized additives used by artisans, glassblowers, and stained glass artists to create unique colors with specific light-refracting properties. The report concluded that the glass fragment had almost certainly originated from a piece of high-end, handmade artisanal glass. The specific combination of colorants and rare earth minerals was so unique that it acted as a signature. The lab couldn't provide a name, but they had provided a profile. The person who had created this glass was not a factory worker. They were a craftsman, an artist. The report also noted that based on supplier records from the era, the specific minerals used were distributed by only a handful of specialty chemical companies in the Pacific Northwest during the 1970s. Detective Rossi sat at her desk, the 2-page report glowing on her monitor. The case had been blown wide open by something she couldn't even see. For 50 years, the investigation had been lost in the vast, anonymous wilderness of the Olympic Peninsula. The list of potential suspects had been impossibly broad, encompassing every resident and transient who had passed through Beacon Point. But now, the ghost in the glass had given the killer a shape. It had narrowed the search from thousands of possibilities down to a single, specific, and highly unusual profession. Rossi now knew that she was no longer hunting for a random predator who had stalked the woods. She was hunting for an artist who had worked with a very special kind of glass, and who, 50 years ago, had crossed paths with Eleanor Vance and left behind a tiny, invisible piece of himself. Chapter 8. Identifying the suspect, the local artist. The lab report was a map to a ghost. It gave Detective Rossi a detailed portrait of a killer's craft, but not their name. The challenge she now faced was a 50-year-old logistical nightmare: to find a specific artisan from an era before digital records, based on the esoteric chemistry of their work. The investigation pivoted from forensic science to historical research. For weeks, Rossi lived in the past, chasing the faint paper trails of chemical supply companies that had folded decades ago. She waded through dusty state archives, examining microfiche sales ledgers and invoices, searching for a name connected to the rare minerals, neodymium and erbium, that made the glass fragments so unique. Most trails led to industrial clients or large-scale manufacturers, but after 3 weeks of exhaustive searching, she found it. It was a single leather-bound sales ledger from a defunct Seattle distributor that specialized in materials for artists. There, on a page dated July 1974, was a recurring order for cobalt oxide, selenium, and small expensive quantities of the rare earth minerals. The customer's name was listed in neat cursive script: Crofts Glassworks. The address was a post office box in Beacon Point, Washington. Rossi felt a surge of adrenaline as she typed the name into her modern law enforcement database. She expected to find a man who had left town decades ago, or perhaps had a minor criminal record. But the results that populated her screen made her sit back in her chair, a cold sense of disbelief washing over her. The system wasn't showing her a ghost. It was showing her a legend. The search results were filled with local newspaper articles, community awards, and photographs of a celebrated town figure. The man's name was Silas Croft. The perfect facade he had constructed over 50 years was masterful. Silas Croft, now in his late 70s, was not just a resident of Beacon Point. He was its soul. His stained glass creations were the town's most treasured landmarks. His masterpiece, the Forest Cathedral, was a magnificent window in the town's community church, a breathtaking work of art that captured the way sunlight filtered through the peninsula's ancient canopy. Another of his works, The Sound's Embrace, greeted visitors at the public library where Ellie had once worked. He was a quiet gentleman, a widower, who lived alone in a beautiful, secluded home and studio just outside of town. He was known for his philanthropy, for donating art to fund the high school's music program, and for his almost mystical reputation as a man who could bend light and color into something holy. He was, by all accounts, the saint of Beacon Point. Rossi knew she couldn't approach him directly. A man who had maintained a secret for this long would be careful, his defenses impenetrable. So she began to circle the truth, starting an investigation into the man everyone thought they knew. She returned to Beacon Point, this time under the pretext that she was a writer doing a historical piece on the region's artists for a magazine. The townspeople were eager to talk about their most famous resident. Martha Miller, now a silver-haired woman who still ran the general store, spoke of him with reverence. "Silas," she said, her eyes lighting up, "he is the kindest, most gentle soul this town has ever known. He took all the darkness of these woods and turned it into light. He is a gift to this community." The praise was universal, a chorus of admiration that made the forensic evidence on Rossi's desk feel like an accusation against the town itself. But Rossi was looking for the man from 1975, not the beloved icon of 2025. Digging through the town's historical society archives, she confirmed he had opened his studio in 1972. He was 30 years old when Ellie disappeared, a relative newcomer to the town, but already gaining a reputation for his unique glasswork. The question of a connection to Ellie, however, remained elusive. There was no mention of him in Sheriff Brody's original files. He wasn't a friend, he wasn't a known associate. The link, when she found it, came from Leo Vance's archive. Tucked inside a binder labelled Town Events 1974-1975 was a faded, black and white photograph from the town's annual Founders' Day Arts Fair. The photo featured a smiling Eleanor Vance, standing proudly beside a display of her charcoal sketches. But it was the background that made Rossi's breath catch. There, standing near a booth displaying colourful glass sun catchers, was a young Silas Croft. He wasn't looking at the camera, he was looking at Ellie. His expression, even in the grainy photograph, was one of unnerving intensity. It was the first, tangible link between the saint and the victim. The forensic evidence was strong, but Rossi knew a skilled defense attorney could argue it away. They could claim the fragment was the result of casual, secondary transfer, that Ellie had brushed against a piece of his art in a shop, or that the fragment had been carried on someone else's clothing. The case was still circumstantial. Rossi needed more than science. She needed to understand the psychology of the man who had committed the perfect crime. She revisited the details of the disappearance, now viewing them through the lens of a meticulous, calculating artist. The careful placement of the sketchbook, the location of the coat, these were not the panicked actions of a brute. They were the deliberate, thoughtful actions of a creator, someone staging a scene. He had created a narrative of a girl lost to the woods, a mystery that would send everyone looking in the wrong direction, while he quietly assimilated himself into the fabric of the town, becoming its most admired citizen. As the autumn of 2025 began to mirror the season of Ellie's disappearance 50 years prior, Rossi knew it was time. She had the forensic link. She had the photograph that placed him as an observer in Ellie's life. She had the psychological profile of a man capable of incredible patience and control. She sat in her car, parked on the winding road that led to Silas Croft's studio. The late afternoon sun streamed through the stained glass windows of his workshop, casting brilliant, jewel-toned patterns on the ground. It was the same beautiful, treacherous light that Ellie had loved to chase. Rossi looked at the glowing glass, a mosaic of cobalt and forest green. It was the same type of glass, made with the same rare minerals that had held a killer's secret for half a century. She was about to knock on the door of a monster who had built a life of astonishing beauty to hide an act of utter darkness. Chapter 9. The Killer's Confession. The door to Silas Croft's studio opened with a soft chime. The man who greeted Detective Rossi was exactly the person the town had described. He was in his late 70s, with a shock of perfectly white hair and kind, pale blue eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He was dressed in a simple, clean work apron over a pressed shirt. He was not imposing. He was grandfatherly. The studio behind him was breathtaking, a space where light and color conspired to create magic. Large, finished and unfinished stained glass panels leaned against the walls, and the air smelled of solder, wax, and the faint, clean scent of ground minerals. He welcomed Rossi and her partner with a gentle, unassuming warmth, offering them hot tea against the autumn chill. He seemed not just unafraid, but genuinely pleased to have visitors. Rossi accepted the tea, her mind racing as she tried to reconcile the monster from her files with the gracious old man before her. She began as she had with the others, explaining her supposed article on the heritage of local artisans in the Pacific Northwest. Silas was a willing and eloquent subject. He spoke passionately about his craft, about the chemistry of color, and the physics of light. He described the challenges of his early years, of sourcing the right materials to create the unique hues for which he had become famous. The forests here, he said, his gaze drifting to a large window that framed the dense woods. They have a particular kind of light. It's green, but it's also blue and silver. Capturing that, really capturing it, requires more than just standard pigments. You have to add elements that bend the light in just the right way. Rossi leaned forward, her expression one of journalistic curiosity. What kind of elements? Oh, all sorts, he said with a wave of his hand. Cobalt for the deep blues, of course. Chromium for the greens. But the real secret, the thing that makes the light dance, that comes from the rare earths, neodymium, erbium. They add a subtlety, a luminosity you can't get otherwise. Very expensive, very difficult to work with, but worth it for the result. He had walked directly into her first, carefully laid snare, admitting to the use of the exact elements that constituted the glass's unique chemical fingerprint. Rossi let the conversation drift for a few more minutes before she carefully placed a folder on the table between them. She slid out a high-resolution copy of the 1974 Arts Fair photograph. In my research, I came across this picture, she said, her voice even. We're trying to identify all the local artists from that day. You're here, in the background. Do you happen to remember the young woman in the foreground? The one with the sketches? Her name was Eleanor Vance. Silas Croft looked at the photograph. His smile did not falter, but for a fraction of a second, his eyes lost their warmth. It was a subtle shift, a momentary disconnect, like a cloud passing over the sun. He looked up at Rossi, his expression one of polite concentration. Vance, he said, tasting the name. I do seem to recall that name. A tragedy, wasn't it? The poor girl who got lost in the woods. A terrible thing. But no, I can't say I knew her. Just a face in the crowd from a long time ago. Rossi held his gaze. Her own tone shifted, shedding the pretense of the writer, replaced by the quiet authority of a homicide detective. That's interesting, Mr. Croft, because we have reason to believe you were the last person to see her alive. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The gentle artist disappeared, replaced by a man whose eyes were now cold and hard. He placed his teacup down with a hand that was perfectly steady. Detective, he said, his voice dropping, losing its folksy warmth. That is a monstrous thing to say. I'm an old man. I have lived in this community for over 50 years. My reputation, my life's work, speaks for itself. On what possible grounds could you base such a vile accusation? On the grounds of science, Mr. Croft, Rossi said. She watched him carefully as she began. When Eleanor Vance's coat was found, a button was loose, hanging by a thread. Embedded in that thread was a microscopic fragment of glass. For 50 years, that's all it was. But a few weeks ago, we took that fragment and we put it in a machine. That machine read its chemical signature. It told us the exact recipe of the glass, down to the parts per billion, the specific ratio of cobalt and chromium, the trace amounts of neodymium and erbium. It's a signature as unique as DNA. And that signature, that recipe, it belongs to your glass, and only your glass. "We found the ghost of your art on her coat, Mr. Croft. It's been waiting 50 years to tell us it was there." The colour drained from Silas Croft's face. The composure he had maintained for a lifetime crumbled in an instant. The tremor started in his hands, the steady artist's hands, and spread through his entire body. The perfect facade, built over 5 decades of careful deception, was reduced to rubble by a witness too small to see. He stared at Rossi, his mouth slightly agape, the kindly grandfather replaced by a cornered predator. He said nothing. Rossi softened her voice. "Tell me what happened, Silas. After 50 years, it's time for the story to be told." He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, the hardness was gone, replaced by a profound, hollow emptiness. The confession, when it came, was not a torrent of guilt, but a quiet, methodical recounting, as if he were describing a piece of art he had made long ago. He had seen Ellie around town, at the library, and at the arts fair. He had been mesmerized by her. It wasn't just her beauty, but her focus, her connection to the natural world. He felt he was the same. He didn't just make art. He channeled the essence of the forest into his glass. He convinced himself they were kindred spirits, that she was his muse. He invited her to his studio on that October day, under the pretense of showing her a new piece that captured the color of the deep woods. She was kind, he explained, and that was his undoing. She praised his work with genuine admiration, but when he spoke of his deeper feelings, of his belief that they shared a special connection, she had gently rebuffed him. She was polite but firm. She had to get home to her brother. She was not interested. To his mind, a mind that saw the world as something to be shaped and controlled, her rejection was not just a refusal. It was a flaw in the perfect creation he had imagined. When she turned to leave, something in him broke. He described the murder with a chilling technical detachment. There was no explosive rage. It was a quiet, efficient act of cancellation. He had struck her from behind with a heavy piece of iron he used for shaping frames. The cover-up that followed was his masterpiece. He was an artist, and this was his greatest project. He knew the woods, the tides, the habits of the town. He drove her body out to a remote, rocky point on the coast, a place he knew from his fishing trips, and committed her to the deep, cold waters of the Sound. Then, he began to stage the scene. He drove her truck to the Callaway Trail to start the search in the right place. Days later, under the cover of darkness, he placed her sketchbook, knowing it would be found and interpreted as a sign of a girl who had simply wandered off. He snagged her coat on the thorny bush himself, a piece of misdirection to suggest a frantic flight through the undergrowth. He even joined the search parties. He described the feeling not as guilt, but as a thrilling, godlike sense of control. He stood shoulder to shoulder with the people searching for the girl he had murdered, listening to their theories, offering his own quiet words of hope and sympathy. He had created a perfect, unsolvable work of art, a living mystery, and he was its sole, secret curator. As he finished his story, the afternoon sun streamed through the magnificent stained glass windows of his studio, throwing patterns of brilliant green and blue across the floor. The light he had claimed to worship had, for 50 years, hidden the truth of the darkness he carried inside. Chapter 10. Resolution, Justice, and a Final Goodbye. The confession of Silas Croft fell upon Beacon Point like an axe. The news didn't just spread, it fractured the town's very identity. The man they had revered as a saint, whose art had been woven into the fabric of their most sacred and civic spaces, was a murderer. The beautiful stained glass windows in the church, once a source of pride and solace, now seemed to hold a sinister glare. The light they cast was no longer seen as holy, but as a beautiful lie, a 50-year deception rendered in cobalt and chromium. People who had known him for decades replayed every polite conversation, every kindly gesture, now searching for the monster that had hidden so perfectly behind the placid mask of the artist. The community wasn't just shocked, it felt complicit, as if they had all been unknowingly tending the garden of a wolf while one of their own lambs had been missing. The trial, held the following spring, was a formality. With a detailed, recorded confession and irrefutable forensic evidence, there was no question of guilt. It was the sentencing hearing that became the town's long-overdue reckoning. The courtroom was packed, a silent congregation of townspeople watching the final act of a 50-year tragedy. Silas Croft, now stripped of his reputation and his art, seemed to have physically shrunk. He was a frail, hollowed-out figure in a drab prison jumpsuit, the light he had once commanded now seeming only to expose his pallor. But the courtroom's true center of gravity was Leo Vance. He sat in the front row every day, a quiet, constant presence. He was no longer the frantic teenager or the obsessive archivist. He was simply a brother, waiting for the last page of the story to be written. When the judge addressed Silas Croft, her voice filled the silent room with a cold fury that spoke for the entire community. "You did not just take a life, Mr. Croft," she said, her eyes fixed on the shrunken figure. "You stole a future, and in its place, you meticulously crafted a mystery. You used your artistry not for beauty, but to orchestrate a 50-year torment. You watched a family crumble. You watched a town grieve. And you stood among them, offering condolences for a pain you yourself had inflicted. That is a special kind of evil. The court cannot sentence you for the 50 years of silence, but it will hold you accountable for the moment of violence that started it all." Silas Croft was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that would ensure he would die behind walls, a world away from the light and forest he had claimed to love. For the town, it was a form of closure. For Detective Rossi, it was the satisfying end to a case that had bridged generations. But for Leo Vance, it was something far more complicated. He drove home from the courthouse and walked into the room that had been his life's work. The walls, covered in maps and notes and strings, no longer looked like an active investigation. They looked like a museum exhibit. The question that had been the central organizing principle of his entire adult life, the engine that had driven him for 5 decades, had been answered. And in its place was not peace, but a vast, terrifying silence. What did a man who had dedicated his life to a single question do when that question was gone? For weeks he drifted through the house, a ghost in his own life, the purpose that had sustained him now extinguished. One warm day in late July, when the forest was alive with the hum of summer, Leo made a decision. He carefully, methodically began to dismantle the archive. He took down the maps, filed away the notes, and coiled the colored strings. He wasn't erasing his sister. He was finally, after 50 years, laying the investigation to rest. He left only one thing on the wall, a single, framed photograph of a smiling 21-year-old Eleanor, holding up a sketch of a barred owl. The next morning, he drove his old truck not to the mill, but to a specialty nursery 2 counties over. He returned with a small, carefully wrapped bundle. He drove to the Callaway Trail, a place he hadn't visited since the day of the verdict. The old, unofficial blockade had been removed, but the trail was still overgrown, reclaimed by the quiet insistence of nature. He walked into the woods, the air warm and smelling of pine and damp earth. Sunlight, the same soft, dappled light Ellie had loved, filtered through the canopy. He didn't need a map. He walked for nearly 20 minutes, his feet finding the old, forgotten path until he arrived at the base of the towering cedar tree where, 50 years ago, a young logger had found an abandoned sketchbook. He knelt down on the mossy ground. From his bundle, he carefully unwrapped a small potted plant. It was a ghost orchid, its ethereal white blossoms looking impossibly delicate in the rugged forest. He used his hands to dig into the soft earth, making a small hollow at the base of the tree. He gently placed the orchid, the flower his sister had been sketching in her final moments, into the soil. He didn't say any words. He didn't need to. This was not a funeral. It was a return. He was bringing the last unfinished piece of her art back to the studio she had loved. For 50 years, the forest had kept a secret, hidden in a sliver of glass too small to see. But for 50 years, a brother's love had kept a promise, a vigil too strong to fade. Justice, when it finally came, didn't arrive with the bang of a gavel, but with the quiet rustle of a man planting a flower, a final, silent conversation with a sister he had never stopped searching for. The tiniest of clues had unraveled the darkest of secrets, proving that no mystery is truly unsolvable, and no one is ever truly gone, as long as there is someone left to remember them. If you want to continue listening to such stories, subscribe to our channel, Afterlight Cases. See you in the next video.